Hey y'all, this is Vincent Tseng, the Wandering Warrior, martial arts, adventure, and storytelling, and today this video is going to be about a story, an interesting, peculiar event in Taiwanese history, the local lore of this area. It's going to involve a warlord and cultists and Holo lumberjacks and farmers and Taiwan tribesmen who came together in an alliance to fight a common enemy. Check it out.
Tapani, the Last Alliance.
In 1895, the Japanese began their conquest of Taiwan. While it was given over to them by the Qing dynasty, the islanders formed the Republic of Formosa and resolved to resist. While the Chinese soldiers still here were demoralized and pathetic, Taiwanese militias engaged in stubborn guerrilla warfare. The invaders would need to conquer Taiwan town by town, village by village. To this, the Japanese responded with modern warfare, massacre, burning, and mass rape. For over a decade, Japanese soldiers and police clashed with guerrillas, be they Holo, Hakka, or Aboriginal. This frontier of the Qing Empire was fundamentally changed as 100,000 Japanese soldiers occupied it. Lands were appropriated for the Japanese Empire and key industries were taken over by the colonial state. Despite stubborn resistance and good use of the terrain, the guerrillas, using muskets, spears, knives, and captured rifles, were clearly outmatched by the Imperial Japanese military. Thus, 2 decades later, many Taiwanese were beginning to accept their new ruler. However, some continued to fight. In August of 1915, 20 years into Japanese occupation, thousands of Taiwanese would take up arms and rebel. A month prior, in July, there was already a failed attempt by the Taiwan. Here at the forested foothills, on the eastern edges of today's Tainan and Kaohsiung counties, formerly the hunting grounds of Tzolik tribes, the residents, Taiwan indigenous tribesmen and Holo locals, were infuriated by abuses and disenfranchised economically by the nationalization of the lumber industry. There was also a band of guerrillas entrenched in the nearby hills. Conditions were ripe for an uprising, and it would find itself led by 3 interesting figures. Yu Qingfang, known locally as Wu Qingpang. This man was the primary leader. He was born in today's Pingdong City, and though schooled, due to poverty, ended up working in a small shop in today's Zuoying of Kaohsiung County. He was 17 in 1895 when the Japanese invaded, and he enlisted in the volunteer army. Clearly that was a short career, and he later became an assistant police officer in the Tainan prefecture for 8 years. In 1904, he resigned and joined a Zaijiao cult, a kind of vegetarian group with Buddhist and folk religion elements. They were involved in anti-Japanese conspiracies and wished to get the Qing Beiyang army to liberate Taiwan. Qingfang was caught and put in a reformatory for vagrants, the Jialulan in Taidong. He was released in 1911 and was an insurance salesman, a wine seller, but went bankrupt due to poor business management, and then sold rice. He found his way back to religion at Tainan's Xilai Shrine, where he once again began to recruit anti-Japanese followers who referred to him as a master with supernatural powers. It gets better. See, he was sought out and joined by an even more interesting character, a man named Luo Jun, or Le Zun in Taiwanese Minnan. This guy was a village school teacher and he studied medicine, feng shui, and divination. He was wrongly implicated in a case of banditry and escaped to China. Secretly, he returned, only to find out that his wife had remarried, his concubine took over his real estate, and his sons were dead. So, with his family destroyed, he returned to China and later traveled throughout Southeast Asia. At 60 years of age in 1914, he secretly returned to Taiwan again. He became entrenched in the folk religion and claimed to be able to protect followers from blades and bullets, as well as teaching the art of invisibility. He also claimed to have a magical sword that could kill 30,000 men in an instant, only being drawn 3 inches out of the sheath. At Xilaian or Xilai Shrine, the two of them promised their followers, that they would be able to drive out the Japanese, that the Beiyang army of the Qing dynasty would come to assist them, that toxic rain and wind was going to annihilate the Japanese soldiers. Yu Qingfang would become the emperor of the Taiwanese, and to assist his followers, they sold talismans. These talismans could protect your wealth, stave off plague, and protect you from bullets. And not only that, if you sold them to other people, you get 30 to 50% off of yours. I'm not kidding. This was a pyramid scheme. A pyramid scheme of magic. These two interesting individuals linked up with a Jiang Ding, or Gang Ding in Taiwanese Minnan. He was actually a fighter. He fought the Japanese as a guerrilla militant and was surrounded in 1901 but managed to escape and kept on the fight. When he linked up with these two, he was already the commander of a guerrilla militant group in the mountains and had already been gathering followers and killing more Japanese. They were the founding fathers of the 大明慈悲国, the Great Ming, Kingdom of Mercy. And thus the rebels were mustered, armed with farm tools, knives, and classic weapons used in the Songjiang militia training, such as spears, glaives, and rakes, and psychologically fortified with the paper talismans, which are promised to make them invulnerable to bullets. As much as I'd like something like that too, it sounds insane. Yet we have only to look around to see other similar phenomena in the late 1800s. Such rituals and talismans didn't work for the Boxer Rebellion in Shandong, China. Amulets called anting anting didn't work for the Polahanes of the Philippines, and ghost shirts definitely didn't work for the Lakota at Wounded Knee in 1890. But all saw their societies compromised at the hands of foreigners. Perhaps when the will to resist only hardens, but the means fall short, the desperate mind eagerly latches on to magic and millenarianism. That is when a society believes a massive transformation is destined, and that often their or their leaders' rituals and actions can bring it about. I think you know where this is going. The rebels were actually doomed from the start. In the summer, between May and June, the Japanese police had already discovered the plot. Yu Qingfang fled to the mountains while Luo Jun tried to escape in disguise, only to be caught by the police in June. Yu Qingfang and Jiang Ding held tight in the mountains with their guerrilla fighters and volunteers, while the Japanese forces surrounded them. Then they moved. July 6, 1915, they hit Jiaxian. July 14th, Jiang Ding's son was killed in action. In August, they hit police stations. It is said the insurgents pretended to be postmen delivering letters, and as soon as the police opened the door, they would be immediately rushed by the guerrillas. On August 6th, they were engaged by Japanese infantry, artillery, and military police, and literally found themselves outgunned. Although killing dozens of policemen, the guerrillas suffered hundreds in casualties. Allegedly, the Japanese also massacred thousands of villagers out of revenge. Obviously, the talismans did not work, and the insurgents were forced to retreat. August 22nd, 1915, Yu Qingfang was trapped and captured by the Japanese police and village collaborators. Jiang Ding kept up the resistance but was surrounded in the mountains, and the Japanese promised clemency for anyone who surrendered. As more and more of his men turned themselves in, Jiang Ding surrendered as well, April 1916. Despite the promises of no punishment, on May 18th they were arrested and brought to court. 1,957 were tried for banditry and thus no due process. 866 got the death penalty, hundreds were put in prison, and so on. In a rare show of sympathy, the Japanese public and the government were severely critical of the colonial response to this uprising. In November 1916, the Governor General of Taiwan commuted the death sentences to life imprisonment. However, it was already too late. 95% of the prisoners had been executed, including the three leaders, Yu Qingfang, Luo Jun, and Jiang Ding. And so ended the Tapani Uprising, or Taimani in Taiwan, the last alliance of Plains Aborigines and Han people against the Japanese, and the last of Han Taiwanese resistance against Japanese rule, 20 years after the initial invasion.
It's so interesting because there's elements to the story that remind you of the Boxer Rebellion, the Native American ghost shirts, the Purahanes in the Philippines, that cultish aspect. And then there's that mix of guerrilla warfare, cross-ethnic alliances. Such an interesting thing. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed that story. An interesting cautionary tale and a really cool point in Taiwanese history. Off to the next destination. Thank you for joining me on my journey. Also yours.